Hey everyone, welcome back to Bikini Bottom. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the progress or loading components in Material UI. Now, this component is probably one of the simplest component in Material UI. There's not too much you can do with it, but it's also pretty useful, and we probably don't need a code sandbox to explore it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all the different variants you can have when it comes to these progress bars and all the sort of props you can pass in, but honestly, they're pretty intuitive. So the first thing you have to know is there are two main components. You can either have a circular progress component, which is sort of like one of these circles, and there's a bunch of different states you can have them in, or you can have a linear loading component, and there's also a bunch of different states you can have with that. So let's go over each of them. So first of all, for the circular component, you can have the majority of the circular components are what are known as indeterminate, which means they don't really give any user any information on how long it's going to take for this component to finish loading. So as you can see here, this is probably the simplest example. You just pass the component in. You don't even have to, specify any props or anything. And a lot of the times in React, you might have a state variable called loading. And in that loading state variable, you just set it equal to true or false. And if it is true, you would just display this loading component wherever you need to. A popular use case I have for this specifically is if I am loading a page and I have to load a bunch of data in, that data might take 2 or 3 seconds. While there's no data, I might have one of these bad boys pop up on the screen just to let the user know that there are still things coming and the page didn't crash or anything like that. So that's probably going to be your main use case with one of these indeterminate circular loading bars. You can, of course, pass in a couple of different variables. Some of them include color, which just like every other Material UI component, the color will be derived from the actual theme. So for example, if you put it to secondary, by default, the secondary theme color is this purple color, and so forth. You can also make it sort of determined in the sense where it is sort of like semi-filled in depending on how much you are loaded in. And this will be the same thing for the linear progress bar, but whenever you have a determinant variant, all you have to do is pass in a value out of 100 of how much on a scale of 1 to 100 the thing is loaded. So for example, if you pass in 25, it'll look like this. But a lot of the times, if you're keeping track of someone's progress and it's loading in, that value will probably be a dynamic variable, and you can just pass that variable in like they do over here. And if we were to actually look at the code, they just use a set interval where every 0.8 seconds, they just increase it by 10%. And that's how you get this sort of cool, smooth animation where it increases. So a lot of the times your logic in your code, if you're using one of these, will be different, but for their example, that is how they did it. Now, another cool thing about the circular bar is if you nest it within a box component, which is another Material UI component, which we're going to go over in the future, and you put it next to a icon or you put it next to a button, you can actually have it sort of load on top of the icon or load it within the button itself, which is pretty cool, especially if you are doing something like hitting a button where you send data to the backend and the backend has to process that, and then it will return a result back to you, or it will return whether or not their query was successful or not. So that is a pretty cool feature of this component as well. And then finally, we get to one with a label, and all you have to do is use sort of a separate component called CircularProgress with label, and all that will do is you pass in a value and it will show the actual progress value inside the actual thing. And if we look at the other props for this CircularProgress component, you can see we talked about color. You have some standard things like classes, size. So this size will give you sort of a pixel value, I believe, of the diameter. So if you just pass in a numeric value, it will change the diameter to be bigger or smaller in pixels. You can also pass in a string like 3 rem if you wanted to make it something related to that. You can also pass in the SX prop, which we have a whole video on, that will allow you to just change its stylings. And also, the thickness of the actual circle-y part itself, as well as the value and the variant, which we talked about. Now let's move on to the linear progress. So the most simple linear progress you can have is the indeterminate value. As you can see here, it just sort of like loads indefinitely. And this is, like I said, good for a lot of times if the user is going through something and they click and it's waiting on a result. That might just be like a nice little placeholder or something like that. You might see this animation on like a lot of placeholder websites and stuff like that whenever some of the components aren't fully loaded in. I believe Coinbase does something similar on their site. You can also pass in the color prop. You can also make it a determinant one as well and give it a value. So that'll just, slowly fill out the entire bar depending on what the number is from 1 to 100. And then we get to some of the cool use cases, like for example the linear buffer. In this case, the big line will sort of be this sort of like dotted line, and then you pass in two values, the progress and the buffer. The buffer will sort of be like a YouTube video buffer where it will have sort of a grayed out line in front of where your actual progress is. And then both of these values ideally will be changing as the progress increases, just like a YouTube video trying to buffer, how you see the little bar, the red bar catch up to the gray bar on the whole global timeline of the actual video. Then, of course, you can have another one with the label, and you can use a different component for this. So just linear progress with label, and you just pass in the value, and the same thing will happen. Then you have some really custom use cases if you are interested in that. For example, you can they tell you how to like delay the appearance and stuff like that, and they do mention that through a bit of user experience and user research, they found that normally you don't want very special feedback during a button press, but you do want it to be within the range of 0.1 and 1 second. But afterwards, sometimes you can, display something after a second if you wanted to have a delay for specific use cases. And it's sort of like really edge case type stuff. So if you want that, I'll link the description, this whole documentation in the description, and you can go ahead and, check on that if that's something you're interested in. They also talk about some of the limitations in the documentation on CPU load. So for example, you might, under heavy load of your website, you might lose some of the animation frames in the circular progress, depending on how much load the front end of the site is under, and of course related to the user's actual computer as well, and how much they can handle on the site. So that's just some of the high level low level interactions you can get with this component. And of course, if we were to look at the API, it's almost the exact same as the circular. The only difference is you have this buffer and query prop that you can pass into the variant. And buffer we talked about, but that is pretty much it for one of MaterialUI's most basic components. And if you found value in this video, don't forget to leave a comment. It helps so much with the YouTube algorithm, and subscribe if you want to learn more about MaterialUI and React. And I'll see you guys in the next video.